Hey everybody, welcome to Latter-day Struggles. So grateful to have you guys all here today. Happy to have Nathan here by my side as well. How are you today, Nathan?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good. We're here on a mission. We're part 3 on a 5-part series talking to you guys about the struggles that we are going through. Many of us who are struggling in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with some variation of a faith or trust Christ. Much of this podcast is focused on helping us become psychologically and spiritually developing and developed human beings so that we can manage the complexities that our church is going through right now. We are in a period of a lot of change and a lot of growth. There are tons of opportunities in our church to become better than ourselves, to become accountable, to stand up and be different than we have been historically as a church, as an institution. And so what we're doing in the last 2 episodes, like I said, today is episode 3 of 5, is we're talking about the LDS Faith Crisis report that was published by a group of scholars about 10 years ago. It has not been widely known. There are a few of you out here who know about it. The church headquarters has a copy of it. They received information about it, and it is in their top secret vaults. But of course, they are not the owners and the authors of this faith crisis report. So those who created it have, of course, made it available to us. And Nathan and I have gone to a lot of effort to break this down and organize it and package it in a way that is easy for you to digest so that you can better understand the nature, what they studied, what they came up with, what they found. And maybe this will resonate with you because maybe this feels a lot like something that you have gone through yourself. So go back 2 episodes if you want a broad overview of this study. In the last episode, we talked a lot about the demographics and the factors that played into people that were in the survey, why they went into what their faith crises were about, what they were feeling, why they left or why they were struggling, and what some of the personal repercussions were, and some of the pain that they went through. So I'd invite you to go back 2 episodes to get caught up if you haven't already done so. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what these researchers found were the 5 stages of faith crisis. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a overview of this, and then we're going to break down each small part of these 5 stages of faith crisis. And so what they did is they discovered that while everybody's situation is, of course, different, and there were over 3,000 respondents in this survey, they did start noticing that there were some very, very typical and expected ways that people would manage their own specific faith crises. And so these similarities is what they noticed and when they put together this diagram. Okay, so everyone begins in this faith crisis realm as a true believer. Then there is a catalyst of some sort, at which point in time, the true believer runs into some psychological trauma. And then there's a fork in the road, and these folks that go through the trauma, they go down one of 2 paths. One of the paths that they go through is where they try to navigate nuance and stay in the church. And the other is where they become so traumatized that they end up leaving the church. And so Nathan and I are going to actually walk you through each and every one of these steps and stages in faith crisis. And also we're going to take you down both forks in the road. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and get going? Why don't you start with the first one, babe?
Yeah. So we've talked in the past about stages of faith development, and these steps that we're about to talk about fall into the same stages of faith development that we've talked about with the PEC.
PEC is episode 33, My Sunstone Symposium. So go back to that if you want to go real deep into that.
So in PEC's stages of faith development, which are the easiest for me to understand, there's a stage 2 and a stage 3. And everything we're going to talk about here falls into one of those 2 categories. So I'm going to start with what a stage 2 person looks like, or what they call the true believer. So the true believer is someone who is absolutely committed to all of the truth claims of the church. We believe in God, we believe in Jesus Christ, we believe in the restoration through the prophet Joseph Smith. But more than that, we believe in the living prophet. We believe that this is the one and only true church on the face of the earth. We believe that the Book of Mormon becomes the evidence that this is and can be the only true church on the face of the earth. And we support and sustain the living prophet, seer, and revelator But implied in that, the sustaining of the prophet, seer, and revelator is that he's infallible, never makes a mistake, never the general authorities never say something that they shouldn't, and that we as members don't question it. And that if something seems weird or backwards or contradictory, there has to be a good explanation for it. If we knew a little bit more, we could figure everything out. And we kind of live in these mental places where everything is right. And if something seems wrong or contradictory, it's because we don't understand something.
I also notice in this true believer, or you could call it an orthodox phase or a conformist phase, at least a phenomenon that I've noticed in our church is, while we lean or we've moved a little bit more towards being able to say that they make mistakes, they never actually apologize for the mistakes that were made. It's a very sort of it's like a global thing.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of actual sort of accountability for the specific nature of the mistakes that have been made and the implications and how many and what people it has hurt. Anything else you wanted to say about that?
No.
Okay, so this true believer is many, if not most of us. I know that many of us that go through complex relationship with faith is, here's the deal. Let me just put it this way. That back to Peck stages of development, most of us as children become little conformers because there's a lot of reinforcement for that. And that's actually developmentally appropriate for people that are young and that want sort of someone to tell them where to go, what to do, and how to do it. And so for many of us to begin as little conformers and to enjoy a church that tells us exactly what to do and how to believe and how to get to heaven, and it's really like clean cut and crisp and it has all the right answers, that's 100% appropriate for us to feel when we're in our lower and less developed stages of psychological and spiritual growth. Okay, the deal though is that in all faith traditions, we should move out of that conformist stage and we should move into a place of complexity. Mm-hmm. So you're going to find this is the case in any faith tradition. Our faith tradition, however, it's a little bit more of a complicated sort of process because most of the time, the catalyst for growth out of conformity or orthodoxy and into skepticism or into a deeper relationship with our own faith is catalyzed by truth claims. It's catalyzed by the realizing or the waking up to the fact that something that we thought was simply believable is no longer, we come to realize it's not true anymore. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit. So the next phase after the true believing phase is there is what they call step 2 or stage 2 of faith crisis is called the catalyst stage. Okay, so the report here says the faith crisis catalyst is an event that can initiate and precipitate a loss of faith for the true believer. They say that there can be dozens of reasons or dozens of catalysts, but they stated that amongst those that were in the report, there were a few that were pretty across the board. These were the most common catalysts for faith crisis. I'm not sure if these were listed in order of how many people had them, but I'm going to go ahead and just list a handful of them. One of the things that was a catalyst for faith crisis for many people was receiving a teaching calling or assignment to teach or speak in church, which led them to the internet, which led them to uncorrelated information on the internet, which led them to the often incredibly disorienting experience of recognizing that what they had learned in the correlated books that the church published was not so. And this put people in a massive spiral where they wanted to believe that this wasn't true, but they began to recognize that a lot of what they were reading was actually in fact true, and what they had been told was a sanitized or a whitewashed version of the truth. And that brought about a lot of trauma, which is the stage 3 that Nathan's going to talk about in a second. Let me just talk to you about a few more catalysts. Traditional media is another catalyst. So when I talk about traditional media, I'm talking about news sources pre-internet. So we're talking about CNN, Newsweek, PBS, and other such outlets that have reported on controversial issues in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they really would confuse lifelong educated or those who thought they were educated members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This report actually states that there were many members who were completely devastated to later learn that after they watched the South Park episode that really highlighted issues of church history, they came to realize that the South Park episode was more accurate than the actual correlated history of the church. Right? Ouch. So that would be another catalyst so traditional media is another big catalyst for faith crisis. Another one is when a close family or friend it goes into faith crisis, and when one has the compassion to actually in fact listen to what they're going through, they start recognizing that, oh my goodness, my loved one or my friend is actually making some valid points. And so, is faith crisis potentially contagious? The answer to that is yes, especially when we're working with an institution who has struggled in being honest. Okay, point number 4, the catalyst for faith crisis is non-correlated church books. So these can even be scholarly scholarly books that are faithful members of the church that are doing the heavy lifting of actually teaching true church history. We're talking about, say, D. Michael Quinn or Leonard Arrington or Richard Bushman. These folks have had the courage to talk about the realities of church history, which is only problematic because the church history had not been honest before. What they're doing now in their scholarly works is actually correct and honorable and honest, but it brings about faith crisis in those who have only listened to and believed the sanitized version of the church. So these really good scholarly works can actually bring about faith crisis. Okay, the next is new media. Of course, anything that you find on YouTube, Facebook, blogs, and whatnot, that brings about faith crisis. In some, others are the catalyst for others is a reexamination of truth claims because they are confronted with social issues. That means, let's just say they have a family member who comes out as gay or lesbian or trans, and all of a sudden they have to really start challenging the doctrine and the theology because they are now living an embodied experience with somebody who before, when the doctrine or the theology was only metaphorical, it was fine. But all of a sudden, when you know someone and love someone, things stop adding up. The math stops working. Another catalyst is someone may go through a tragedy in life and begin to have the courage to re-examine their own beliefs. Once again, this is evidence of someone who is probably progressing and growing in their own personal development, and they're challenging a lot of the dogma that they have never challenged before. And so they start looking into, what do I really believe? What is my stance on this? Not what people told me, not what I was told to believe, but what do I in fact believe? Most of the time, or frequently, tragedy or crisis brings about a sort of a catapulting of one into one's own ability to self-reflect and become more psychologically and spiritually mature. And one other thing that I wanted to just share a little bit about is that something that really hurts people when they are moving into faith crisis after they've had an event that is a catalyst is when the brethren make statements that actually make things 10 times worse. Okay, I'm going to just read a little paragraph here about this. It says this: during the catalyst phase, many struggling members begin experiencing a sense of cognitive dissonance or feelings of discomfort when presented with data that contradicts their previous beliefs. This dissonance can often be magnified by well-meaning leaders who, in the efforts to bolster faith, actually present dichotomous messages that leave little room for nuance, error, or leader fallibility. Here are a couple of examples of quotes that really hurt somebody who has been catapulted into a faith crisis by a catalyst event. Okay, this is by President Hinckley back in 2007. He said about the gospel, it's either true or false. If it's false, we're engaged in a great fraud. If it's true, it's the most important thing in the world. Now, this is the whole picture. It is either right or wrong, true or false, fraudulent or true. So what this does is it puts people in a bind where they recognize, well, I'm actually learning that this is false. And so if I do in fact have to throw the entire thing out, then I will do so. These leaders are majorly hurting us as a body when they make statements like that, because they're demanding of us to look in black and white ways at that which is very complex, which is why people, of course, oftentimes they comply and they leave. Statement number 2 is a quote by Joseph Fielding Smith, where he says, Mormonism, as it is called, must stand or fall on the story of Joseph Smith. He was either a prophet of God, divinely called, properly appointed and commissioned, or he was one of the biggest frauds this world has ever seen. There is no middle ground. Well, anybody that has done even a tiny bit of research on the prophet Joseph Smith has got to have the ability to manage the complexity of a very, very large middle ground in the works and life of the prophet Joseph Smith. Okay, so let's move on. That was the catalyst phase. Nathan, why don't you take us down the path of where people to the traumatized believer phase.
Yeah.
You ready for that?
So a couple of thoughts, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One of the things that we both read when we were kind of doing our own research was that about 75 to 80% of what people call anti is actually just our actual church history. And sometimes it's presented in ways that are intended to be destructive to people's faith, but it's really not been altered. I mean, it really is just the church history. And you read me one time a quote from Leonard Arrington, who was one of, or maybe the first actually trained historian to
The
be the
first.
church historian.
Yeah.
And he was musing. I don't know if this was in a journal or to a friend, but he said, I struggle with the balance that I've been given, the commission that I've been given, which is to tell the church's history, but also to only do it in a way that promotes faith. He recognized that you can't tell all of the church's history and keep it clean and make it all 100% faith promoting. He knew that. And that, I think, was one of his big battles the whole time he served as the church historian. And so I don't understand why it's been so hard for the church to come to that recognition and say, yeah, there is a messiness here. And these all or nothing statements they really are quite damaging. For me, studying a lot about the life of Brigham Young and his teachings on blood atonement and his terribly racist views on society, I mean, you would have to come to the conclusion that he can't be a prophet if you are forced to take an all or nothing stand.
Correct.
I mean, there's nothing about blood atonement or believing that there are sins that we can commit on this earth that can't be covered by the atonement of Jesus Christ that makes any sense to me. So I have to be able to live in a middle ground that Brigham Young did some prophetic things, and he also had some personal viewpoints that I don't agree with. And so, yes, there has to be that middle ground. There has to be.
Well, I noticed that this faith crisis report actually talks about how there is actually a way to reconcile church history with the promotion of faith. And it has to be reframed around helping people understand that all human beings and all institutions are wounded and fallen and in need of an atonement. That's really the only way you can frame our church history in a faith promoting way, where we can basically say a lot of mistakes have been made, a lot of people have been wounded, and yet we as a body are trying to access the healing power of the atonement of Jesus Christ. Yeah. And need to do so through the atoning of our own sins of what we have done wrong, but not only what we have done wrong historically, but the hiding of the history itself is something that needs to be atoned for, needs to be, repented of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so after coming into contact with some of these historical issues, they talk about this stage of what they call the traumatized believer, which is someone who's still sort of grappling between these two worlds. We're still trying to hold on to this pseudo community, this stage 2 childlike faith that everything is right and nothing is wrong. And the reality that's staring us in the face is that, yeah, there are a lot of problems here. They talk about some of the difficulties in church history in this list. And this is a list that we just barely gave in our previous episode. So I might just hit a couple highlights, but it's Joseph Smith's history, polygamy, polyandry, his belief in folk magic, treasure digging, giving different accounts of the first vision, translation differences in the Book of Mormon, changes to the Doctrine and Covenants. Then there's kind of some of these other issues that we've talked about with Brigham Young, which is the race and the priesthood, the blood atonement, the Mountain Meadows massacre that happened under Brigham Young's watch, the Adam God teaching that he gave. There's also things past that when you get into things like this idea of lying for the Lord. Now, this is one we haven't brought up before, but this is a really interesting concept. This idea that was brought out, and Elder Oaks gave a talk on this once, saying that there are times when it is okay to lie and be deceitful on behalf of the Lord. That should make the list. That definitely should make the list.
So is this list that you're talking about, these are the things that people are like what they're traumatized about? Am I getting that right?
Correct. So these are the things that they start grappling with.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. It's like, okay, these things really did happen. Brigham Young really taught that we should slit the throats of interracially married couples. That really happened. He taught that multiple times. And so now you're like, well, gosh, that doesn't jive with what I've learned about love and about kindness and so forth. And so we live in this kind of this state of what on earth is going on. Okay. So other things that come up besides church history, awareness of scientific issues. I was just talking to my cousin who has her PhD in zoology, and boy, this has been a big one for her. Just the history of the age of the earth and our denial of evolutionary processes, if I can speak. Other scientific challenges, things that are presented in the Book of Mormon that we have no physical evidence of. Native Americans having more DNA from Asian populations than from the Middle East populations. Stories that just don't seem plausible for the Old Testament. There's a re-examination of theology and doctrine. For instance, the Book of Mormon seems, and the Old Testament both seem to promote God-sanctioned genocide, God-sanctioned racism, sexism, questions about whether there's only one true church or whether we should be taking the scriptures literally. There's a re-examination of cultural issues. Does our church actually oppress women? I was always taught growing up that it didn't matter that women didn't have the priesthood. It didn't matter that they weren't in leadership positions. Everybody's eligible for the same blessings, that God provides to men. And I bought into that for a really long time. And the hiding in plain sight of sexism, racial issues we've already talked about. Then there's the newer issue that we're having to face, which is the LGBTQ issues that are out there. There are a lot of people that do not accept the church's black and white stand on same gender attraction, gender confusion, and these issues that are out there. Okay, so a traumatized believer also is now having to confront spiritual issues. And this is a one that we hear a lot about. People who have had spiritual experiences that lead them to believe that there is good in the church, there is truth in the church. And I am one of those people. And yet finding it completely incongruent with some of our own personal standards that we've developed. Then there are people who feel like they haven't had spiritual experiences or that they feel like they've been burned out by the church. Then we have re-examination of institutional issues, the unquestioning obedience of leaders, the inability to disagree with them, the shame that one feels should you decide to vote opposed to a particular leader or to a particular policy. There's the culture of patriarchy, there's the secrecy behind finances, and so forth. So these kinds of things come out, and now you're living in this in-between stage where you've had these beliefs, they're very important to you. You may have had some spiritual experiences that you feel like confirm the truth of some of these things, and yet all these other social, historical, and spiritual issues have to be confronted now. And you can't go back. And that's one of the things that they point out is that once you've seen these things, once you've learned these things, once you've confronted these things, you cannot, in your own mind and in your own integrity, simply block them out and revert back to a stage 2 of spiritual development.
You can't unsee what you've learned, what you've come to see through this faith crisis experience. Okay, so we started with the true believer. Then there's a catalyzing event, which is phase number 2 of faith crisis. Then what Nathan just talked through is the traumatized believer then has, not only are the things that were on the shelf, all over the ground, but there are a number of other things that start emerging when we start having the courage, or when, quite frankly, we are in the situation where we have to look at the whole messy picture. And Nathan just walked through what most of the people in this faith crisis survey talked about were the things that they had to basically wake up to and make sense of and grieve over and reconcile and grapple with, and how painful this process was for them, that they wished, I know for myself, I've said this to you before myself, Nathan, that it's like, man, it almost has the feeling of like, I know we always talk about Adam and Eve, but it has the feeling of leaving the Garden of Eden and like being in this new place. And like, almost there's a grief that I felt that now I know all of these things. And now I am responsible for growing up my soul and reconciling how am I going to make sense of my relationship with this institution in a way that is integrity based and is wide awake and accountable. Okay, now we're going to move on to, once we hit the traumatized believer phase, we hit the fork in the road where people go in one of 2 directions. Okay, so I'm going to take us down one road, and then Nathan's going to take us down the other road. I'm going to start by going down road number 1, which is where someone makes choices to become what is called in this analysis, they call it the less literal believer, and ultimately ends in a place of called the secular participant. Okay, so this is where somebody has moved through the trauma phase, and I'm not convinced that, like most steps and stage models, it's not like you just go and you move forward all of the time, but rather you probably were bouncing all over the place. We may move into one of these phases and then actually move back into trauma sometimes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this less literal believer looks like if they choose to go down this path. They enter into a phase of nuanced belief, and what these researchers found is that people navigated their nuanced relationship with the church in a variety of different ways. Okay, these are some of the strategies that they used. Some of them built or rebuilt a shelf where they put unresolvable doubts and concerns. Now that confuses me a little bit, Nathan, because we just talked about how you can't unsee. Is
Yeah,
this people that choose to sort of not address and acknowledge certain things
right.
and just close their eyes to it? So in other words, I guess it's
They're
saying that
trying to go back to stage 2.
so they see it, but they're basically trying to not see it. That feels to me like that wouldn't last very long because the cognitive dissonance would be too strong.
Yep, but some people try it.
Yeah. Okay. Another strategy that people use in their nuanced belief stage is they're less literal believers is they become what is often called a buffet Mormon by cleaving to doctrinal and cultural elements that spiritually work for them. And they choose to ignore the doctrinal and cultural elements that spiritually do not work for them. Okay, the next strategy that people use is for many, belief becomes more metaphorical and less literal. To me, that feels more spiritually progressive than some of these other strategies that I'm noticing, where it's almost like there's an ignoring of. This one, this less literal
Mhm.
and more nuanced, to me feels more like Scott Peck's stage 4, where he moves into like a little bit more of a where we have the potential to move more into a mystical faith, which is we recognize that we understand and appreciate some of the beauty that comes from the church, but we don't take everything very literally.
Mm.
And then the next strategy that people use is they remain active and participate in the church because they believe that this is where God wants me. I'm going to be honest with you. As I'm reading through this, I'm not resonating with most of these personally.
Mhm.
This feels in some ways like there's a little bit more denial rather than actually reconciling, coming to peace with a relationship with the church. I'm wishing, or I'm thinking that in my podcast, what I'm trying to invite people to do is actually stay wide awake and become reformers and changers. I guess I don't know, I'm using aloud, but I'm finding, what do you make of that?
Well, I think what they're making of it is what they found. I don't know that these
Yeah,
are their suggestions. I think these are
right.
the strategies that people have tried to use to deal with it. And I think most of these strategies are not going to work completely.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of it I've thought about, like for instance, like my relationship with the government. Okay,
Hmm.
I like living in America. I don't agree with everything the government does, but I can be okay with that as long as the president of the United States doesn't try to make me believe that he's the infallible voice of God and that everything we have to do, everything that he says we have to do, as long as we come to the conclusion that we're all just kind of doing our best, I think some of those strategies may be okay.
Okay, so what you're describing, I think, is helpful for me. These people are describing the way people are trying to manage nuanced belief. Whether or not they agree with it is independent.
Yeah.
Okay, they do, however, talk about the challenges of these folks. So when these folks go down this path of nuanced belief, they say this: while these folks oftentimes remain active, many members unfortunately experience a decrease in their level of commitment to the church. Well, of course they do. And they give the examples of they cease to pay tithing, their temple attendance decreases, and other things like that. Other elements that become challenges to folks in this phase are they often are unable to confide in anyone, which can result in desperate loneliness and increased anxiety. Okay, well, I had this is anticipating why I was kind of like, this is not a good plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Many of the less literal believers experience a difficulty feeling authentic at church. And for many, this emotional distress and cognitive dissonance can result in members transitioning to the less believing faith crisis stage and disengaging completely from the church. Okay, so what I think they're trying to get at, you guys, I'm having an epiphany here, even though I have studied this quite extensively, is they're recognizing that most folks that go into faith crisis, when they try to be less literal believers, this does not go well for them. And it's because they are feeling fake. They're feeling inauthentic. They're feeling shame. They recognize that in their community, they don't have a place. They have no one to talk to. They have to posture that they feel a way and are a way that they aren't feeling and they're not acting true to themselves. And this causes massive amounts of emotional and psychological pain and injury. And most of the time, these folks tend to end up leaving the church. Okay. And that's probably why this podcast that Nathan and I are doing is resonating with many people, because this is something that I am not wanting people to end up having to do, which is basically live inauthentic to themselves, to stay in a tribe and end up leaving.
Now this particular pathway that they're talking about are not the people that leave, though. These are the people that just hurt.
Well, they actually do eventually sometimes leave. You'll notice here, because it says here that oftentimes
That's
these
true.
folks
They can cross over
try
eventually.
less literal belief. They try to sort of posture and pose and, do their very best, but they oftentimes can't hold on because it doesn't feel
So
congruent.
eventually they end up leaving.
They end up leaving eventually. Now, what this does is, so if you've got your less literal believer, they end up turning into what the study calls, this is the fifth phase. They're called the secular participant. And a secular participant is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a member of the church who don't believe in the claims and doctrines of the church, but they basically kind of just don't take it seriously anymore, but they still sort of show up for social reasons. They may say things like, I enjoy the church. It works for me. There's nothing better. And so this is a place of almost having really given up on having an authentic relationship, at least with the institution, if not with God. The challenges of this, if you go clear to the fifth phase through from less literal belief to secular participation, is they also to continue to remain silent about their disbelief. They don't want the negative social consequences because of what the survey calls social excommunication. They can't talk to people. They can't express their concerns. They feel very inauthentic at church. And a lot of people in this stage continue to participate, but oftentimes this builds up a lot of internal pressure. And oftentimes they end up leaving the church altogether, once again, because it's not a psychologically or emotionally healthy place to feel like you have to posture and act like an entirely different person than what you're really going through to fit into a community. What this really brings up in me is that most of the time, or all of the time, we are navigating as human beings this desire for autonomy and this desire for connection. And it sounds like in this, if you go down this path, people desperately want the connection, but they find that they cannot do that while being true to themselves. Okay, so why don't we take us back to Nathan? So once we hit the traumatized believer phase, I just walked you guys through less literal belief that leads to secular participation and often complete disaffection from the church. Now Nathan's going to take us through the other path, which is the traumatized disbelief phase, and then take us through there.
Yeah. So another way that stage 3 of PEC spiritual development can look is that you just throw everything out. You just say, I've been lied to, and the whole thing is a farce. So the way they describe this is that for many, the loss of trust in the church translates into a loss of faith in God, Jesus Christ, or any religious belief. They call it hitting rock bottom, or the dark night of the soul, as a term that you'll hear a lot. And the challenge of this phase is, as we've already mentioned, in my mind, the big challenge of the phase is that you're throwing out a lot of things that could be potentially good and useful still because of the trauma from all of the issues that we've already talked about. You have this kind of loss of sense of identity because the church was such an integral part of your life. You have a loss of sense of your foundational values. Oftentimes they lose family, friends, or if they live in highly LDS communities, they could even lose their jobs over these kinds of things. They feel like they don't have anybody they can trust or talk to, and they oftentimes will suffer from depression and anxiety. And then they go on to describe what some of these ex-Mormons or post-Mormons describe
So hold on,
as their experience.
Let me just, so
Yes.
what he just talked about is there's the fourth phase on my path was called the less literal believer. The fourth phase on this other path is the traumatized disbeliever. So these folks in my path, people try to stay in for a while. In Nathan's path, they leave immediately. And then he's taken us to the final phase on Nathan's side, or on Nathan's path, which is basically called the ex or the post-Mormon.
Yeah. So they've resigned their membership, or at least they've whether they've literally resigned it or whether they've just figuratively resigned it, they no longer consider themselves Mormon. And again, they feel isolated. They feel like they can't talk to or trust family members who are still active in the church. They have this huge amount of anxiety and turmoil. They feel victimized. They also start to engage in self-destructive behaviors in response to the way that they feel that the LDS church is treated them. So for instance, they might take up drinking, not because they want to drink, but because they're mad at the church. They spend months analyzing what's gone on in their lives and all the lies that they have been. And then they have to go through this transition phase where they have to develop a new identity, a new moral framework, a new social community and a new coping mechanism with dealing with questions of like, where did I come from? Why am I here? And where do I go after I die? They have to start to re-answer all of these questions for themselves because they have had in their own minds to reject everything because of the revelation of the truth claims.
So what I'm really picking up on as we're analyzing this together, Nathan, is that the faith crisis committee, these experts and researchers are trying to communicate to the brethren that at present, what their research is finding is there is no path to healing inside of the church in faith crisis until the church actually starts to not only acknowledge the suffering that's going on amongst these people, but that the church needs to acknowledge the problem and help nurture the people that are suffering. Because I'm looking at both of these paths, and both of these paths are not psychologically or spiritually healthy paths. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. And the problem is that the church wants everybody to go back to stage 2. But what we have to learn how to do, and what neither of these paths address, is moving to stage 4. So the stage 4 of spiritual development necessarily requires going through the turmoil, going through these faith crises stages, whether it's leaving the church or staying in the church in a nuanced manner, but moving past that. And you mentioned in one of your podcasts this idea that anger is a great gas station, but not a hotel. We stop there, but we don't stay there.
Right.
And I think that's what these reports are eventually trying to get us to is that I don't think you can avoid the faith crisis because the truth is out there. But what you can do is a better job of helping people get through the anger phase and find a peaceful phase on the other side, what Peck calls his stage 4, what Richard Rohr would call the second half of life. That stage does exist, but not many members are finding it.
Well, and I think it's made challenging to find when the root of the problem is a lot of truth claims and struggles with doctrine and theology that are not necessarily in keeping with what we would consider a loving gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And that the church is not stepping up to the plate and owning the parts of the problems that they could own to help mitigate the faith crisis that is happening.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, what these folks are trying to help the brethren understand, which is this is absolutely happening. It's happening in large numbers. And there are parts that both parties can play. The leadership of the church needs to take a step forward and take ownership in the truth claims, that the historical issues that have haunted us and wounded us as a body. And they also could stand to look at the social issues that are really, really not in keeping with the gospel of Jesus Christ, espoused by so many of us who want equality in issues around gender, race, sexuality, things like that, that are really hurting a lot of people in the here and now in our church. Yep. And then on the flip side, us as individuals need to start psychologically growing up ourselves and learn how to be more psychologically and spiritually complex human beings at the same time. Yep. And so both parties have work to do, but it is very challenging to work through a faith crisis when the instigating party or the parties that have not acknowledged a lot of the problems are acknowledging them either not at all or very, very slowly and vaguely and vaguely and indirectly. Okay, yeah. You guys, this is once again a massive dump of information that Nathan and I are trying to sort of package and deliver to you in bite-sized portions. Luckily for you, if you want, you can listen to this more than once. You may need to, because this is just a lot of information. In the next couple of episodes, what Nathan and I are going to go through is the next 2 sections of this faith crisis report. The researchers go through something that they call the perpetual cycle of disaffection. This is a psychological and emotional look at what people feel and hear and what they go through when they are going through this faith crisis. And then the 5th episode of this series is going to be, of course, recommendations, what these experts recommend that the Q15 look at and address and take very, very seriously to actually mitigate the problem of faith crisis that is so deeply impacting our church. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. I know I'm pretty tired. We've been talking for a hot minute here on this topic. Thank you guys so much for being with us today and each time that you're here. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your willingness to share this and every episode with the people in your lives. This is one of those really important series that we really want to get out there. This is something that is not well known, that needs to be well known. It's a phenomenon that people are experiencing more than I think we believe. This report itself talks about the large number of active LDS church members who are in faith crisis. the number was very, very high of people that are actually attending every week and are suffering from exactly what we have been talking about in this series. So please spread this. Please share this episode with people in your circles. Share it on social media, share it on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever you spend your time on social media. Please help the word get out. If you have not already done so, it would mean ever so much to us if you would write a rating and review on Spotify or iTunes. And please be aware that if this is something that you're directly going through, if you're going through the trauma of faith crisis, I did not ever anticipate this to be the case, but I was a trauma therapist, and having started this podcast, I'm recognizing that there is trauma out there, and I'm more than happy to shift some of my daily practice as a trauma therapist to you. And so if you're interested and want to join a group where I facilitate a weekly conversation with you and a handful of other people that are going through the same thing that you're going through, please reach out to me through Instagram at Latter-day Struggles Podcast. Let me know if you're interested, or you can go ahead and email me at info@valeriehamaker.com, and I will get you some information about how to join a small group. Space is limited, and the number of groups that I'm going to be doing is, of course, limited also, because it's just I'm sort of building them into my clinical day. So if you're interested, please jump on that, and I will see what I can do to work you into one of these small groups that are forming rather rapidly. Grateful for all of your support, and I'm happy to be on this journey with you. We'll take care, and we'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.